We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Why is it so difficult for men to demonstrate vulnerability in their intimate relationships? Well, this is a question we are going to answer today with my guest, Silvy Khoucasian, who I found when I was researching attachment styles online. Now, she is definitely one of the foremost experts out there talking about attachment styles. However, she is here today to help us dive into why it is so difficult for men to open up vulnerably in their intimate relationships. Now, if you've been listening to this show for any amount of time, you know we've covered vulnerability and manhood and masculinity before, but not to this degree in how it relates to intimate relationships. So if you are a man out there who has fears or has been burned in the past when you've shared your vulnerability with an intimate partner, this is for you, because this is going to help you learn how to demonstrate healthy boundaries and how to find the right people to open up to. And for those of you out there who want to support your man in creating a safe space for him to open up, you're going to enjoy this as well. This is the Mankind Podcast. G'day and welcome to another live recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there is more than one way to be a man. In many ways, we're trying to simplify manhood. My co-host Boyson always likes to joke that we're complicating it, and well, isn't that the male experience? Now, today we are joined by a wonderful guest, someone I've been following for quite a while right now, Silvy Khoucasian. I got that right? Yes, beautiful. Who joins us today. Now, Silvy is a renowned expert in intimate relationships and boundaries, whose sole mission is to support others in being deeply and soulfully self-connected, to use their self-understanding to create fulfilling relationships with others. Now, she has a master's degree in psychology, marriage and family therapy, and is the founder of the Love with Integrity podcast, which will be linked in the show notes to the show that you can all check it out. Silvy, welcome to the Mankind Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, Brandon. Truly.
Yeah. The pleasure is all mine. Now, I initially came across you when someone at some event was talking to me about attachment styles, and my brain was like just popping off left and right. Like, it's like the first time I learned about Enneagram, like my world opened up. And so you were the first person I found when I started looking kind of on Instagram and who were the people that were experts in those spaces. Now, as much as I would love to dive into that, today, more specifically, is going to be reserved to talking about vulnerability within relationships, and more specifically, why it is so challenging for men to open up about or share their vulnerability with their intimate partners. Now, you and I sitting in these seats, we have a myriad of reasons or experiences or things that we've learned that could lead to that. We see this in our men's circles all the time. But just from the jump, tell us a little bit from your experience of working with men and what might be some of the most common hang-ups with being vulnerable.
Yeah, there's so many different intersections of challenges that men have to face to cross the bridge to vulnerability. And I think having those experiences validated helps just validate and make sense of why it can be so challenging. You know, men are conditioned from an early age to be strong, to be, ambitious, and really repress so many of their core emotions like sadness and fear. And so, you know, when those core emotions are repressed early on, it's really, really difficult for those emotions to be regulated as adults. So it's not only the emotional regulation piece that's really challenging for men as they grow, it's the narratives, it's the constant, it's almost like I like to say there's a double bind. I want you to be vulnerable, but then when you're vulnerable, I'm going to judge you because I have this narrative and expectation that you're supposed to be, you know, high status, you know, successful, have all your shit together. And it's such a paralyzing intersection, I think, that many men are rightfully confused and feeling paralyzed with, right?
Well, it certainly lines up with my upbringing and my experience, where those moments where I trusted my closest friends with my vulnerability, it was used against me. And I think a big motivator for talking about this was I reposted a video that's gone viral a couple times. It recirculates every couple years of a man. I believe it's within a church space, but there's clearly a large crowd that he's speaking to, and he's got a lot of young men around him. And he's sharing that to women out there, or to anyone that's in an intimate relationship with a man, that when your man finally takes the risk to share something that he perhaps may have never shared with anyone else, and you then use that against them in an argument, in a debate, his words were, "You've lost him. He will shut down, and he will never open up again." Now, I disagree with the absolute nature of what he was saying, but it definitely, I felt that kind of knife in the stomach experience of like when I have shared things in vulnerability and it's been used against me. It's like, oh, dude.
Yeah.
You know, I either want to bite down on my mouth guard and throw one back, or I want to retreat and go, well, reset the timer. It's going to be a little while before I open up again in that way. Have you seen that clip by chance?
I haven't seen the clip, but I've seen it. I've seen it in my practice when I'm working with couples and coaching them, and I've seen it. You know, I sure have not been always the best at receiving vulnerability of men, because we're all conditioned to those same mixed messages. And I think you're absolutely right that when a man does finally get to the point of feeling safe to reveal these sacred parts of themselves, we have to be so present and aware of the delicate nature of those moments. And I agree with you, Brandon, that I think that you can come back from that, but there has to be profound, immense amount of repair and responsibility and just awareness of like, why did I do that? Why am I, using these moments to punish? And really teaching people that there's more direct ways to communicate what's happening. Usually that's happening because the other person is also unable to, probably be vulnerable and open and honest about what they're going through. So they're using it as an attack and trying to take that power back when they feel powerless,
Yeah, it makes it, this is, I can see the messiness that comes up in this, because just from my own experience in various different relationships, it was like when I went there to that vulnerable place, I could witness the fear arise in my partner, whomever it was, be like, wait a second, like we can't both be in a shaky place right now. Like I need you to be solid. I need you to be solid right now. And in those moments, I was like, where can I can be, so I have to be solid here, but where can I work on this stuff that is really starting to eat me from the inside? Fortunately for me, I was able to then find men's work and men's groups and mentors and, 8 years now, every week.
Wow.
I host one in my house. Like these men's groups have been phenomenal for me, but I have experienced that kind of, I don't know if it's a dichotomy, but it's like, okay, I need to be strong right now and with whatever's going on in my relationship, but man, I need to speak about this. I need to share what's happening inside of me. Where are the beginning? What would you recommend for couples that may be stuck in this kind of maybe a gridlock or unsure of how to properly hold space for this? What do you recommend as some of the best beginning stages or places to start?
I think you said something that's really important, especially for people that are not in a relationship right now, that I think have this fantasy of this lack of messiness and perfection and doing this perfectly and doing this, I'm going to share my vulnerability and they're just going to hear it great and we're going to be just fine. And it's just, there's so much pressure on modern day love and relationships and this experience of awakenment. And, one of my critiques of masculine and feminine work is that sometimes, again, if we don't use any map with nuance, it can create this rigidity of roles. Mm-hmm. And so again, this masculine presence that's supposed to take everything. And if he is in a relationship with a female partner, she can express herself and he's just supposed to take it. And it's so harmful. I think that's so damaging, because then it also robs the other person of having to potentially communicate their insides in a way that's respectful, kind, non-shaming, and really taking responsibility. But you asked the question about what are some kind of healthy approaches. And I think that a really good step is looking at the resistance to vulnerability. So I have a journal that I created, and it has like 10 different prompts to help you really explore your relationship to vulnerability. What was it like in your family of origin? How was vulnerability expressed? Was it expressed? Were you shamed when you were, communicating your insides? And when we kind of get to know those things, we then can understand why it can be hard to take the leap. And when we start to initially express our insights, it's so important, Brandon, and I know you know this, that we look out for certain qualities of people that are warm, that are caring, that are curious, that are non-judgmental, or if they have a moment of judgment, they're aware. They're like, I'm feeling this disgust or judgment or something coming up in me, but that's not because of you. That's because of my own conditioning. So, the self-awareness we have around our own experience of what vulnerability was, how it was modeled for us, I think is extremely important to take some time to explore.
So that's that's such a common place that we end up in men's work is, okay, nature and nurture. What environment was I raised in and who was I raised by in that environment? And that often can influence how we look at relationships, enter into relationships. How much, because I can hear the men listening right now being like, well, how long is that going to take?
Yeah.
How long is that going to take diving into my family systems? And so what do you say to that person who might be going, oh man, I'm in a relationship right now and I have to now like go back and look back at all this stuff? What are some words of encouragement you might have for men who are feeling that right now?
Well, it's interesting. The timeline is so different for each person. We can do this work, Brandon. You've been doing it for 8 years, men's group. I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've been in therapy for 15 years, and there's always more to explore. There's always more. You're going to be learning about yourself forever. And I think if we look at it as like a specific timeline, we're doomed, in my opinion, because this is a lifelong journey. And I think the moment you take that step that, okay, I want to build a life to cultivate self-awareness so that I bring that into my relationships, it's a lifestyle change. I mean, I imagine a lot of guys that are listening, they work out, they're taking care of their physical health, and it's the same. You're taking care of your mental and relational well-being, and it doesn't, I don't think the leap into vulnerability takes as long. It's a moment, but it does take some time to kind of prepare yourself in the sense of what to look for and what boundaries and moving towards it in appropriate stages. Those are things you can learn, but we often also learn from doing it wrong too. And I think there's so much value in that as well.
We kind of have to touch the stove, right?
Exactly,
To learn
exactly.
enough times what it's like to get burnt and what choices we've made to put ourselves in those circumstances, certainly. But the visual that has always helped me is, okay, I'm pursuing my relationship with my wife or pursuing whatever goal I have. How's the journey going to be if I keep dragging these balls and chains behind me? Whereas if I can go back and do the deep work, I can unlock them, let them go, and the journey should be a little less arduous. Still going to be tough, no doubt. Words of encouragement for any men out there who may feel a little isolated right now. Being in men's groups for relatively the short amount of time I have been has given me everything I have today. There is absolutely no way I wouldn't have settled, probably still doing van life alone somewhere in the desert. Whereas now, married, daughter, like we have a vision of where we're going together. And this work makes that possible. And maintaining and sustaining those relationships and my own growth within them, those spaces make that possible. So for those of you that are looking for those spaces, Sylvie, I want to ask you, what qualities do you recommend your male clients look for to find cultivate safe relationships, find spaces like men's groups? How do you guide men in those directions?
Yeah, I think you said something really important. My husband also, there's only so much he can bring to me compared to what value he experiences in his own men's group. There's certain things that he can share over and over again. And yes, I can validate it and be present to it, but being in the presence of someone who has such a similar life experience as him, and, men walking together as brothers, it's very different. So I think, looking for people who also value vulnerability. One of my core values is vulnerability in my life. Like it is so essential for creating intimate, genuine connections. And if we're going to people who are not interested in that, there's some people want to keep things light. They want to live life in a very surface way. That's totally okay. That's fine.
And nice to take a break every now and then.
Yeah, and we need that too sometimes.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there are some people who live their entire lives that way. They're not interested in cultivating that sense of depth and self-knowing. Those are not going to be the people to go and pour our hearts out to, right? Because it's going to feel one-sided. It's going to feel not reciprocal, and it's going to feel it won't match, you know? So looking for people who also value self-expression and that self-awareness work. Looking for people that are very warm, very validating. So when you share something about yourself, this is what I say, become a relationship scientist. Pay extra close attention to how somebody responds. Are they, does their body language turn towards you? Do their eyes become soft? Do they show emotional attunement? And that's a hard thing to describe, but you feel it when it's there, when somebody's caring and just present with your experience and really leaning towards it. Or are they dismissive and validating, trying to fix it? And the fixing thing is hard for all of us. Let's just own that. Even for me, like there's times where my husband's sharing and I'm like, well, you can do this and this. And I have to catch myself because it's so human when we see our partner or loved one in pain that we want to take them out of that. And so again, not about doing it perfectly, but looking for people who generally have those qualities or are cultivating those qualities in themselves.
Right. So it's always better to find people on the journey as well.
I agree. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That you can be in lockstep with, and certainly shout out to the men's groups out there, because yes, that's what it feels like when, it's a little funny sidebar. When I moved to Chattanooga, I very intentionally I had facilitator experience, built communities. I did not start a men's group here. I looked to see what was available because I had to focus on my stuff, because you probably know this, and maybe your husband Brian feels the same. It's easy to get very distracted by community building and men's work.
Yes.
Everything here was faith-based. I'm not, my journey's a bit different right now. But when we got pregnant, the next week, I had two mates sitting, we were in a triangle, and we started the men's group here, because it was like, I don't know how to be a father. And the two other guys in my group were fathers. So I was like, oh, okay, how can I learn from those that have gone before me? And now we have guys in men's group who are grandfathers, and just that intergenerational wisdom, and men that have been married, been divorced, gone through grief. Just having all those different perspectives and lived experiences is just so valuable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you mentioned, the experience of healthy role models, right? People that they might not necessarily be elders, but they're on the journey. They're in the same milestone that you're embarking on, but they've maybe been on that for a little bit longer, so they can, pass the baton from the back a little bit. But also, it makes me think about the lack of wise elders in a lot of our modern day community, and how much I think people are hungry for that. And we're cultivating a new era of that wisdom in the generation that you and I are currently in, Brandon,
How's that showing up for you? Where are you seeing people our age, our generation, really seeking or finding or creating spaces where we're honoring those that have gone before us, and that, have been on this earth a little longer than us, maybe give us some perspective on some things?
Absolutely. I'm an immigrant. I immigrated to the United States when I was 4 years old, left my entire extended family behind, and came with my mom, my dad, and my sister. It's just the four of us. And we've been kind of glued to each other since. And it was hard for us to kind of find, like, being away from my aunts, being away from my grandmother, my grandparents, basically no extended family around. And, my therapist, she's like my grandmother figure. And I didn't even realize when I was seeking her out that I was seeking out a grandmother figure. And a lot of therapists play mother roles, father roles. And obviously we pay them, but the love and care and tenderness that is present in that relational experience is profound. I mean, I've been with my therapist for 15 years.
Wow.
And I without a doubt, without her wisdom, would not be in the marriage that I'm in, would not be in the friendships that I'm in. And so having that, those kind of people around that have also done that work and are again ahead in those milestones. But I do see a shift happening in our time period. I think social media has a lot of challenges, a lot we want to acknowledge. And I think it's also ripped open a whole world of mental health and self-awareness work. And people are that have been like behind the curtain, that have not been exposed to it, are like, oh my gosh, this is actually really interesting. I've had so many people message me about it when I would post about my attachment styles work, and behind the scenes, like, thank you so much, I tried this with my partner and it worked really great. And so I think that we've kind of peaked we've opened the curtains a little bit, and people are more interested because they can see the value of what it means to really cultivate that sense of knowing oneself.
And I think those that are modeling that the best are the ones that didn't grow up with devices in their hands. I would judge.
Oh man, yeah. It's an odd moment in time, that's for sure, with social media.
And to social media, there's really no getting around it right now. It is very present. I myself find myself like mindlessly, face down on it. And one thing I have witnessed as well, because I have a lot of parents come to me to talk about their teen boys. And I did a little bit of school speaking when I was back in Australia, and I have some insights. I'm certainly not a professional. I'll default back to Dr. Brennan Kwiatkowski, who we had in our previous episode 162. I recommend you all check that out if you have teenagers, because he researches them and talks to them and can tell you what's happening. But I'm seeing these teenagers that there's different values coming into schools. It's like, okay, it's good to be vulnerable, social emotional learning, talk about your feelings. And then they're opening their TikTok and going live and talking about their depression or talking about their anxiety. Or some are even like, hey, it's time to take our SSRIs, everyone pop your pills. And I'm just going, I mean, what I've learned about vulnerability is it's like, okay, who are your confidants? Like, who are the ones that are going to carry your coffin? Let alone now it's blasting and broadcasting it to thousands and opening them into your inner world, which is clearly going through some challenges right now. What are you witnessing? What are you concerned with? And let's just start there as it pertains to broadcasting our issues and challenges on social media.
Yeah, I think it's, it's so personal for each person. Everyone has such a unique relationship with their vulnerability. And one person's vulnerability is another person's normal. And I think, for a long time, sometimes it would be hard for me to even gauge if somebody was sharing something like, is this actually vulnerable for them? Because I would assume that it is, but for them, it doesn't feel vulnerable. And so, my husband has been a public writer for many, many years, and he has a very wide tolerance for the kinds of things he can share. And also, as a man, he's modeling that sense of openness and transparency. And I think that's the distinction between vulnerability and transparency. Somebody can be transparent and open about something, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're revealing something that they feel is vulnerable.
Scary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that distinction make sense though?
I mean, that simplifies it. Yeah. Right. So transparency is just like, well, here's everything about me you can know, right? And
here's what's happening. Here's my truth, but it's not necessarily taking an emotional risk that is revealing their insight. And for some it is. I think there are some people that are crossing their own boundaries and their own line to receive validation, to receive love, admiration, because it is a platform at the end of the day. And we're living in influencer culture, celebrity culture.
Yeah.
And, and I think that you're bringing up a really good question for people that, whether it's online or in person, to just be aware of how you feel when you're sharing and really getting attuned to like, okay, did I share too much? Would I want to share less next time? Like, because there's no perfect formula. We're going to sometimes have to cross the line of oversharing to recognize like, okay. And believe me, I've been doing this work with clients for so long, and there's just no exact formula for how to do this,
So it's up to the individual to really identify what those boundaries are. So you being an expert in boundaries, let's talk boundaries for a second about, boundaries and vulnerability. We've spoken about what it means to find someone who's going to turn towards you and lean in. There's almost a thread that's created there. How can one discover what their boundaries are when it comes to their vulnerabilities?
So this is such a big one, because I think in order to have healthy vulnerability, we have to have healthy boundaries. And so I know we're not going to go into attachment styles today, maybe another episode one day in the future.
We'll do that.
But one of the things when I'm working with clients that have more anxious attachment patterns, they have that anxiety, which can make it hard to self-regulate. They can sometimes overshare and share so much about themselves so quickly, because they want to just know, is this person going to accept me? Is this person going to choose me? So let me just give you everything so that I know quickly, so I don't have to think about it. And obviously that can become problematic, because now you're sharing too much too soon. That can be overwhelming for the other person, and it's not necessarily appropriate to the stage the relationship is in. And then it ends up creating the worst fears, like the person is overwhelmed because that's an appropriate response to too much. Right? So
I've done that. I've been at a party and everyone said something and everyone's like, man, everyone was having a good time till you said that. So I've been there.
Yeah, me too. I understand. And, again, it's one person's too much is another person's, oh my gosh, thank you so much for being so open about that. I've been sitting in the corner of his party just waiting to have a real conversation with someone. So that's why we can, it's such a nuanced conversation where, yes, we want to work on our boundaries. Yes, we want to work on appropriate vulnerability, and we can meet someone where just being our natural self is just such a so attractive and exactly what the other person needs. And, I was even thinking about the public vulnerability experience. Some people value vulnerability, because they struggle so much with shame. And this is kind of like their way of taking the power back, of being able to express things that they may have felt shame about, that they no longer want to feel that. And they also want to support other people to not feel shame.
It's kind of like, I'm going to get naked, basically, like emotionally naked in front of everyone. So I could see the value in that. I could see the benefit in that, where it's like, hey, take your shots. Like I'm just going to go for it.
But with boundaries, like finding what are those, and this is where people can spend time with. If you were to make a list, like if we were to make this really practical, make a list of 3 sections. And on one side, what are the most vulnerable things about yourself that like will not share with anyone until they have really proven to be warm, caring, responsive. You have an extended period of relationship with them where there's enough trust that's been built. And then there's a middle tier where there's certain life experiences that you've had that you want to share with someone, kind of when you've, maybe not at the beginning, but when you're deepening in that kind of middle deepening phase. And then the early stage, when you are just meeting someone, what I like to say is share kind of more, I haven't quite figured out the word for this, but almost like an extension of vulnerability of you. So things like something that touched you, a movie that really inspired you, something that moved you, something that's still a vulnerable emotional expression, but it's not so big that you're going to be in the bathroom talking yourself down because it was just so overwhelming to share, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea of just the 3 kind of columns. And people need to, first of all, it starts with the responsibility, your own responsibility to maintain those boundaries, to find what they are. And it's like, okay, something in the big column here, like people need to earn that. People need to earn access to that. And I must say, in the deep relationships that I've built, outside of my marriage, when someone has opened up and shared one of those things with me and they've taken a risk, what honor to be welcomed in to that vulnerable truth, as opposed to met them on the first day and they're like, yeah, this happened to me when I was 6 and this happened to me when I was 12 and this, and then I lost my dad here. And it's like day one. Whoa. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. But it's like, it's almost like
it can be off-putting.
It can be really it really can be off-putting. And I say that with a little bit of salt in my mouth because I'm so guilty of that. Like I have done that before, and you learn how to read a room
absolutely
over time and be like, all right, maybe I did kill the mood in the party after that one.
Like, I think I went a little too deep for the first time. I'm going to just, wind myself back. But even having that awareness to be able to recognize when we do that and say it out loud and be able to have dialogue about it, I think is what makes it just makes the experience so real and genuine, and we're all gonna do that. But you do learn, absolutely. Yeah. I know when people, because I've worked as an associate therapist and coach, sometimes people, as soon as they meet me, they'll just like reveal this gigantic thing. And I was like, oh man.
Not in this context.
It's so uncomfortable. And I never want people to feel like they can, but it's also like, I'm also so tired, like this is not, this, and I mean, like some really, really big things, Brandon, where it's like, it feels like we're in a therapy session. And so, but it happens. I understand it. But what that tells me is that people are very hungry to be real.
They are. They really are. And because we couldn't be more disconnected in the world right now, even though we have more connection online. Just quickly, it reminds me, there was a movie with like all my favorite, I can't remember the movie, but all my favorite female SNL stars, Maya Rudolph, and I can't remember the movie. My wife and I were watching it, but they're out on a girls' trip and they see Brene Brown like having dinner, and they flood the table. They're like surrounding it, and all of them each rattles off their questions. And Brene, not so subtly, like leans into like, oh, well, the importance of boundaries. So F off.
Exactly.
Like she just like shut it down. You're halfway through sipping a beer and you're like, what? You're telling me what about your childhood? I can imagine that can over time get a little heavy. What's up, everyone? Brandon here, and I want to tell you, you, the busy professional, the dad that's juggling multiple tasks and duties, I want to tell you about something that has transformed my mornings, and it is Magic Mind. Now imagine having energy all day for work, dad duties, and perhaps some to spare in the evenings. A couple weeks ago, I was hitting that afternoon crash hard. The 2 p.m. blues were the soundtrack to my life, and then I got a hold of Magic Mind. Now this is not just any supplement. It has been developed over 10 years by doctors and researchers with over 200 studies backing its ingredients. Now this tiny little powerhouse of a shot uses premium nootropics and adaptogens, and thanks to the advanced nano encapsulation, it absorbs 5 to 10 times faster than any other pill. Now, since adding Magic Mind to my routine, I'm more focused, calm, and that energy sustains all day without the caffeine crash. It's safe, scientifically validated, and it helps me and my wife stay sharp and stress-free. So if you are ready to upgrade your day, head to magicmind.com and use the code UNCHAINED20, that's UNCHAINED20, at checkout to get 20% off your subscription. Now you can find those links in the show notes, that's magicmind.com, and at checkout, use the code UNCHAINED20. When you support our sponsors, you support our show, so I appreciate you as always, and trust me, you will thank me once you get a hold of this stuff. I want to ask you about you shared something in our communications before this about the embracing vulnerability in healthy stages. Is that what you're referencing with like the light? Okay. So that ties it in, the healthy stages of sharing. What a powerful exercise.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
The importance of there's the sharing of yourself, right? In the earlier stages, sharing something that moved you, touched you, that you feel inspired by, and also really paying attention if vulnerability is being also expressed on the other side. Sometimes we can get very fixated on just our own vulnerable expression. And sometimes the other person could be a really amazing listener, support, validator, but they're not actually ever revealing anything meaningful about themselves. And
Sure.
when we're so hungry for to be vulnerable, and that can feel amazing for a while, but we're looking for relationships that are, vulnerability has to be happening on both sides of the street. Otherwise, like I like to say in one of my posts, it's masturbation. It's not, it's literally, it's not an intimate shared experience, right? So paying attention to, it doesn't mean that the pacing has to match perfectly, but over time, I have a few friends that are therapists, and man, they're good listeners. And sometimes I'm like, what's going on for you?
Yes. Rick, my therapist, I said to him, I was like, we were diving deep into something. And I'm like, that ever happened to you?
Exactly.
And he was like, well, in fact, it has. And his sharing really helped me kind of deepen a little bit. I almost think of it on a most basic level when I watch my daughter go into daycare and there's like a new kid, and I watch her kind of like stand there, and she looks over her and she'll come over and like point to a dress, like to show that she likes the dress. And then the other girl will point to her dress. And I'm like, that's vulnerable. Like you're going up and like kind of building that relationship. And so it's a little bit of give and take. And so this simplifies it so much for me. And I'm sure for many listening. Final thing I want to ask you before we wrap up, how can couples best communicate times in which it's, hey, we are together, connecting, sharing our vulnerabilities, as opposed to like, I need you right now. Like I need you to hold it down while I process this and talk about this, so that it's clear to each partner what role they're playing.
So can you explain that, Brandon, one more time? Do you mean like, how do we create a space where there's sharing happening on both sides, whereas the vulnerability is not just one person is doing all the holding?
Yes. So my wife and I will do what's called a stress reducing conversation, where it's very Gottman, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Yes. Yeah. So we walk down to the end of the street, takes about 10 minutes, and that's Christine's time. On the way back, that's my time.
Got it.
And so that's where we can just kind of blah, here's what's stressing us. But then that time where it's like, hey, I need something solid right now. I need a rock that I can just go somewhere with this, and I don't need fixing. I just need to communicate what's alive in me right now.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Every couple has very different kind of structural container creating needs. It's interesting when I work with clients that have more avoidant patterns, they tend to need a lot more structure, because revealing vulnerability kind of in the daily moment feels a little bit too abstract. It doesn't feel contained enough. Sure. So absolutely. And a lot of people just having like meeting time designated. I love the example that you gave, the Gottman strategy of setting the timer, and especially in those earlier phases, I think just being in the practice of asking for what we need, because it's so tempting for us to, want to solve, fix. And in those containers, it's about, I'm going to be sharing, and you're going to be really holding, like you said, being really strong and being able to just be a powerful witness to the expression. And if you have a partner that struggles with that, for example, then it's a really good opportunity for you to be really more clear about what you need. So, do you have time? Do you have capacity? I'd love to share something. And honestly, I just need to vent. I just need to share. Can you just be with what I'm experiencing? And then you get the brain can just kind of turn off the problem solving part, even though it might still be hard for them. They still might do it. And then this is where the loving boundaries come in. If they start going into that problem solving mode, you just, you redirect them. Look, I understand this is a little hard for you to hear. I get it. But you listening is so helpful for me. And I think the feedback towards vulnerability is really also important, because I work with a lot of people where one partner is not satisfied with the level of vulnerability happening on the other side. And so they might approach that in these really harsh, shaming ways. Like, you're not open enough, you're not sharing. And I can understand the frustration when you feel that lack of intimacy, but how do you engage your partner to become more vulnerable? How do you invite them in ways that and also acknowledge when they do, because a lot of times there are
Yeah.
moments that they're not really picking up on.
Yeah.
Right.
Celebrate it. Remind them it's
Celebrating
safe,
it.
right? It's safe
Exactly.
to do this and honor that. Man.
Yes, that's huge, Brandon.
Yeah.
For men, especially, who are often so hard on themselves, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm that man who is really struggling to open up and share something, and someone can go, I mean, this happened in men's group the other night. We don't, obviously confidentiality is important, so no names are shared. But a new man came to circle, and he checked in, and he's like, man, I feel like my whole life, my whole upbringing, I never fit the mold or box of what it meant to be a man. And in our circle, we snap our fingers if someone says something that you resonate with, and every single hand starts doing that, and you watch his posture just sink into his chair. He's like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. Like, it's so rewarding to find someone that can hold that space and hold that information tenderly, and also reward you for being brave enough to share it too. So,
and value you and give you feedback like, wow, you sharing that makes me feel closer to you, because again, men are conditioned to do the opposite of vulnerability. So if they're doing it, it's so, like, you know, Brandon, it's a huge risk, and that risk taking deserves to be witnessed and acknowledged. I really believe so strongly. We should not be asking for more if we're not able to acknowledge what is already taking place. That to me just feels very unfair.
I'm going to have to ask you to say that one more time for the people in the back. We can't ask for more.
We can't ask for more if we're not already acknowledging the good that is taking place. And I'm all about fairness.
Stern but fair.
Stern but fair. Otherwise, what are we doing? You know, we're not making it feel. We're not making it feel. We're just not making it feel safe. Isn't even the right word. We're blocking the very thing that we're asking for.
Man. So here's. Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So here's the final burning question I have. So something that's been really interesting for me in being in this position, in this seat for the Mankind podcast, and previous iterations of the show for the past 6-7 years, is, okay, if Brandon's hosting the Mankind podcast, if he's doing these men's works and hosting these men's circles, he must never have an issue with his manhood or masculinity or challenges, or, you know. And it's the opposite is true. I'm more hyper acutely aware of the areas in which I want to improve and change. How has that balance been for yourself and with being in the relationship space? And does that make it easier, harder with, you know, putting pressures on your own relationship? Because it's like, sometimes I go to my men's group and I'm like, who am I to be sitting in this seat right now? Because I have like an open emotional wound right now.
Last night, me and my husband were having a little bit of an argument. We've been nitpicking each other about some things, and we're doing a really awesome keynote event next April in Canada. And I just had this moment. I'm like, who are we to be teaching this workshop to all these people? And just like, I'm like, what the hell? Like, and we just started laughing and laughing and laughing, because that's like what me and my husband stand for, is just realness and vulnerability. And that's part of the core values of our relationship, but our work. And that it's so challenging because, you know, when you're going through something individually or as a couple, you can't necessarily just share everything publicly. You need to have some boundaries around that, but you also kind of feel exposed in this weird way off all the time. And there's also like, people think they know your whole life story, even though you've only shared parts of it.
They assume that you never have any issues, you never fight, you never argue. I think partly because they're craving to remove the barriers between you, the authority on stage, and their lived experience.
Yes. And I think that what social media has done, which is amazing for any expert, healer, coach, facilitator in the field is that there's a balancing out of power dynamics, which I think is a beautiful thing, meaning like we're allowing the experts to humanize themselves, and there's more of a peer-to-peer dynamic, but there's still so much projection, there's still so much assumptions, and you live with that, and I think that's where finding what your core values are in the work that you do as public figures is so important, and how to do that with boundaries as well. But it's, oh my goodness. Yeah. I'm terrified to get ready for this event. And just like, because of all the pressure of like the expectations of like me, people thinking like couples goals. And look, I'm so proud of the relationship that I have. We've worked so hard. We've done so much therapy. And I do believe that we need couples as role models, 100%, that are imperfect, flawed,
Yes.
human. But that's the kind of role model we're trying to be. We're not trying to be the kinds of role models where like we constantly lead with vulnerability in our inner spaces. I'm transparent in my sessions in appropriate ways, you know?
And that's something that has really endeared your social media account to me, is that I can really get a sense that you're not sitting there going, do as we do. You're sitting there going, let me tell you a story about an argument we had last night.
Exactly.
You know, let me show you the ugly stuff and how we got to the other side. And this may very well work for you. It may not, right?
Yeah.
Silvy,
Exactly.
thank you so much for being in the space and sharing your gifts and doing what you're doing. I have, just in this short 43 minutes with you, have gained so much, and I'm sure my listeners have as well. For those that want more, how can they find out more about you? And we'll make sure to have those links in the show notes.
Thank you so much, Brandon. This was such a beautiful conversation, and you have such a genuine, pure heartedness in your spirit that is so apparent upon just initially just meeting you for the first time. So thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So a couple places, I would say the first place to start would be my Instagram hub. If you want to just kind of get familiar with my work, I share a lot of practical tidbits there on my website. I am taking on some coaching clients. So if any men are listening that want support to really work on their relationship skills. So I'm like a teacher of skills, whether it's boundaries, vulnerability, to really recognize what's kind of getting in the way and teaching you how to do it, to build that skill set muscle. I can share the link with you for that. And then I have the journal. If anyone is a journal and wants to geek out on, it's called 12 Months of Self-Discovery. And it's basically all kinds of journaling prompts to really help you get to know yourself more deeply. And there's a whole section on boundaries and vulnerability and all kinds of goodies. So it kind of helps get that. If you're new to the work, it's a really nice first step.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to make sure links to all of those are in the show notes. For those that have joined us live on the Mankind Project Facebook page, that is in the comments. So you can find the link to the journal right there, and I'll make sure the other links are there as well. Thank you, Silvy. And of course, a huge thank you goes to all of you who have joined us live for another recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there is more than one way to be a man. What do you say, Sylvia? We achieved that today?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So grateful for all of you guys that are here and listening. And I'm always just so amazed by the men that show up for this, truly.
Lots of love. We'll see you all next week. This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your hosts, Boyson Hodgson, and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guests and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener. Because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. That is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.
Hey, it's Boysen here with the Mankind Podcast. We are closing in on 100 5-star reviews of this podcast, and we have a goal. Brandon and I want to get to 250 5-star reviews. So help us out, will you? Please? Go to the Mankind Podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a review. Thank you.